This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the next 60 minutes, we'll run through all the business news stories you need to know about from across Africa and beyond. But let's start our conversations this hour, the run through the markets here for you. So let's start in East Africa. Kenya's main index still languishing in the 26 to 2,700 points range, up barely 0.2% today. The market so far is down by over 5% so far in the year. The only one that's actually in positive territory today is the top 40 in South Africa, but the third quarter so far hasn't been particularly kind. It's actually down 1.44% so far in July. Naspers and mining stocks basically powered today's rise. Up north, the EGX 30 also losing steam, down 3.5% over the same period. Here's what's coming up next. We'll explore how Ethiopian Airlines wants to help revive Nigeria's aviation sector. China's economy grows by 6.3% in the first half of the year. And what new incentives is Egypt providing to foreign car makers? All that and more is in the pipeline for you tonight. But let's start in the business of aviation. Nigeria is having yet another go at setting up its national carrier. The government over there is in talks with Ethiopian Airlines, local carriers and private investors to manage a proposed national carrier. The Ethiopian Airlines CEO says that the non-existence of an indigenous carrier in Nigeria, that's Africa's biggest oil producer and home to its biggest single population, fully involved in international operations, is a big threat to the continental aviation sector. Now, the country had announced plans years back to establish an airline, but shortly after that proposal, President Muhammadu Buhari's administration suspended those plans, prompting a fair bit of public outrage. All right, then, so let's dig a little deeper into this particular story in Nigeria's general aviation market. Chris Elebe is an aviation consultant. He joins us now live from Lagos. Chris, thank you for your time this evening. What is the business case for Nigeria's government to be spending its limited revenues on building a national carrier from scratch?
Thank you. I do not think, from the information available to me, that Nigerian government intends to spend a huge amount of money establishing an airline. What the government is doing, or what the government has done, is try to establish an airline that is driven by the private sector. The input is making is to put out a kickstart fund that can kickstart the airline, and then investors from the private sector and technical partners will come in. So government, from the last information available to me, has no intention of spending huge resources to start off an airline.
Right. That being said, though, it's been now 2 years since Arik Air was taken over by the state. If surely the idea was to let the private sector essentially handle this business of creating a carrier for Nigeria, and yet Arik Air is yet to attract outside capital. I mean, surely that says that from a foreign investor perspective, there isn't a business case to invest in aviation in Nigeria, doesn't it?
Well, I'll tell you this. You can look at maybe various business models. The scenarios are different. Arik Air was a private airline owned by a private company, a Nigerian private airline. And it had its own challenges, like most other airlines had their own challenges. Okay, but the state has not taken over Arik Airline. What has taken it over is a asset management company set up for debt recovery, not for airline management. And its bid into its venture into Arik Airline is not a government takeover. It is purposely for the purpose of cost recovery of outstanding debts. So we don't make those mistakes that state government has taken it over. No, it is not true. The models we had before, the airlines we had before, either they were 100% private sector airlines, or the only one that was government airline was Nigeria Airways. It was 100% owned by government. Those models at that particular model is no longer in vogue. And we have realized that the government cannot run an airline. And so that is what they are doing. All that they want to do is have a limited equity in terms of participation. The last plan was not just more than, was to be about 5% equity. That will give the airline a sovereign cover, but that will not be able, that will not be enough for the government to take over that airline and start managing it. So it's a question of giving a startup fund, and when the airline comes in, source a technical partner, a reasonable world-class technical partner to help drive the process, and then get the Nigerians at least to understudy the management and be able to interface and eventually take over the management of the airline. That's what I know is on plan, and but government is not going to invest its huge resources in setting up an airline.
Right, so MOUs were signed with Boeing and Airbus for the supply of carriers as well. So at least the notional exposure of Nigerian taxpayers to this idea extends beyond the 5% equity that you're talking about, doesn't it?
Let me tell you precisely, the news or what is going around that the government signed an agreement with Boeing and Airbus to supply aircraft is untrue. It is not true. No such agreement has been signed. You can find out from Boeing or Airbus. What I know is that at the onset, when the discussion was going on about setting up another national carrier, national flag carrier, Boeing as a aircraft manufacturing company and Airbus, all of them indicated interest. They'll be interested in bringing in, supplying aircraft for that airline. And I do know that these are business people. What they are trying to do is to market their products. And those are the two major companies, at least for regional operation and intercontinental operations. And so they only indicated their interest. There's not been any agreement, as much as I know, and I think that is the truth, that was signed between Nigeria, particularly with the Ministry of Aviation and Boeing, or Ministry of Aviation and Airbus. No such agreement exists.
I hear your argument, Chris, but here's what's somewhat contradictory to me, because the government seems to be putting itself front and center, deeply involved in trying to get this carrier business off the ground. And yet Nigeria has an enormous population, 200 million people. It's a fairly large, substantial aviation market. If the argument is that Nigeria can take off and have aviation services by the private sector, why is the government getting involved? What's the point?
You see, it's always a good question to ask, why is the government getting involved? All the airlines in Africa have their governments involved in it. All the airlines in Africa. And in fact, globally, those that have become private carriers today were all owned by governments, and they were sold off after they have made sure that they were properly established. They were sold off. And so Nigeria is not getting into a different situation. Ghana is trying to set up one. The government is involved, 5% equity. Go to Air Rwanda, go to all the airlines in Africa. So the question, Nigeria has a great population. All the government is trying to do is to make sure that an airline comes into being, because we have so much in terms of population, in terms of the travel public, and we are losing so much in this country. Over $1.5 billion is lost annually to airlines, foreign airlines, African airlines, and other airlines. And Nigeria is not benefiting anything in terms of even manpower, in terms of even developing that sector. And only an airline in Nigeria can do that. You are talking about the private sector. How much does the private sector have in terms of investment in such an airline? We have had them in the past. You talked about ARIC. It's not only ARIC. There are others that you have had before. All of them went their own way. So there's something critical. Is it the business model? Is it poor capitalization? Is it what? These are the things we are looking at. And that's why we say, all of us in the industry say, we will have to get it right. We must have a sound technical partner to partner in the setting up of that airline. And that's what we are talking about. And Nigerians can take off all that they need to do. This is the way to go. This is the way to go. Nigerians are fast learners, and we can take up on that. But
right.
The model that is coming up is a model where the government cannot control it, hook, line, and sinker. That's the model that is coming up. And the private sector will come in, but what we have now in the country, we must admit it to ourselves.
Right.
Our competencies have declined. They have become residual. So we need to learn again, because we can't manage a modern airline with residual competence.
Let me just ask you one last question very quickly. Nigeria's air market, looking at its air traffic, the number of passengers that it handles relative to its population is still pretty small, 14.17 million passengers in 2018. For comparison, Kenya alone that year, 10.1 million air passengers. Ethiopian Airlines by itself carried 10.6 million people that year. What is it that's holding back the development of Nigeria's aviation sector? Is it a problem of choice of airlines? Because I understand at least 20 plus in the country. Is it a cost issue? Is it an infrastructure issue? Or is it all three?
Well, a combination of factors. Of course, you know that the travel public comes, if it's an indigenous, it has to deal with what is available funds to the travel public. Nigeria is coming out, has just come out of a recession, and Nigeria is building up. What fund is available to the travel public will determine the extent to which passengers will come. And that's one. There are other problems. You could say infrastructure, you could say whatever. Well, the Nigeria, the airport infrastructure is something still under development. And you find that where you don't have major carriers, whether they are private sector carriers or whether it's a national carrier, the infrastructure cannot be developed. And so what we are looking at is a holistic thing. When you have airlines, Nigeria is a natural hub in this area, region of Africa. It's a natural hub, but we can't develop an airline hub without formidable Nigerian carriers. No foreign airline can develop a hub for us. So it's only Nigerian carriers that will develop it. And so while government is trying to bring up a national carrier, national flag carrier, whatever you want to call it, is also we help the private sector airline to drive the entire process of aviation development, particularly in the area of infrastructure. That's what is it. But what I am saying precisely is that it's related to the economy. If the economy of a country is not doing very well, then people will not have the funds to fly. Right. But luckily, we are pulling out of recession. And I think that pulling out of recession, we should be able to have more people traveling by air.
Okay, we'll leave it there for the time being. Chris Eligbe, I'd love to continue this debate, but I'll have to leave it there for the time being. He was there live in Lagos. Now, speaking of large infrastructure programs, let's focus on Ethiopia. You do remember it's building this ginormous $4 billion dam project on the River Nile. Now it's on track to be operational by 2022. It's a 6 gigawatt hydroelectric power plant. It's called the Grand Renaissance Dam. It's a centerpiece of the country's bid to become Africa's biggest exporter of energy. CGTN's Girum Chala caught up with Ethiopia's Minister of Water, Irrigation and Energy to get a progress update on this project.
Mr. Minister, thank you so much for talking to CGTN. A few months back, the Ethiopian government has announced something rather disappointing for the people of the country, which revealed the poor performance of the construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Since then, the government has also taken away the projects from local contractors and gave it to international contractors. What can you tell us about the performance of the construction now that you've made lots of change?
Well, the construction of Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is now in full swing. Yes, as you said, there have been problems with regard to the work of steel structures and electromechanical work. And those components were given to the local contractor and the local contractor didn't have really the right skill and capacity to deliver on those. In terms of decision and the vision set by then was basically okay, because this came from the intention of building on national capacity. But however, this kind of complex systems and construction of dams of this size require really adequate capacity and experience.
From the subcontractors, there are Chinese companies with a lot of experience of building such mega dams. So far, what are your evaluations when it comes to their performance of building this dam?
So far, it's fine. What they have done, they reviewed what has been put in place and took out some of the substandard components of the steel structure. Now they are manufacturing the parts in China. That means Chinese companies have got experience of building these three gorgeous dam, huge structures, about 3-4 times of the Grand Renaissance Dam in terms of generation capacity. So this experience get transported here, but in addition, they have been also building our currently operating largest dam, the Gibe 3 Dam, in terms of the electromechanical and steel structure components. So they have very good experience in the country situation as well as doing similar job elsewhere.
On the other hand, the government recently has announced its plan of building 12 solar energy producing plants across the country. From this, many of the projects will be also handled by Chinese companies. Tell us about the projects and the involvement of those Chinese companies.
We're looking at solar projects. As if you have seen our electrification program, Light for All strategy, it's envisaging to provide electricity for all. That means not only through grid system, but also through the off-grid solutions. Especially 35% of the country's population that are living far away from the grid and in remote places, like in the pastoralist areas, require a different solutions than the grid network expansion solution, because to reach a small isolated community with grid is very expensive. It's not really manageable with Ethiopian economy. Therefore, we have to find a solution thanks to the innovative technologies we have at hand right now globally, the solar technologies with a hybrid system that has got batteries and standby generators and so on, can substitute actually the grid and create its own small grids. So the 12 projects are actually for 12 different towns having population between 1,000 to 21,000, so deployed in different regions of the country. Individual isolated faraway homes will also supplied with what we call solar home systems. So in terms of competition, it's not only Chinese, but there are also others who competed actually. More than 78 companies have actually competed for this, shortlisted and evaluated technically and financially, and this is distributed among 4 companies.
All right, then a quick run through some company headlines. Let's start in South Africa. Eskom's Group Treasurer, Andre Pillay, will leave the utility at the end of August. His departure is the latest high-profile exit after the firm's CEO and another executive quit earlier this year. The struggling utility is $32 billion in debt, and it's hinging its recovery hopes on a $16 billion bailout pledged by the government back in February. Tanzania's central bank says it has fined Diamond Trust Bank in Tanzania some $435,000 for breaching the regulatory rules on both data and service availability. Now, the country's been cracking the whip on financial institutions who violate regulations since 2017. Tanzania's financial services sector has been hit by a spike in bad loans that have stifled the growth of credit to the private sector. Elsewhere, American Airlines is extending for a 4th time cancellations of some 115 daily flights into early November, and that's due to the ongoing grounding of the 737 MAX aircraft. Now, the airline's decision was expected after the FAA recently uncovered a new flaw that Boeing estimates will take at least until September to resolve. And finally, AB InBev, the world's biggest brewer, has scrapped its planned listing in Hong Kong, effectively cancelling what would have been the world's largest IPO in 2019. AB InBev had hoped to raise nearly $10 billion from its listing of its Asia-Pacific subsidiary, Budweiser Brewing Company. Hong Kong has been battling to win listings by big international firms amidst trade tensions between China on one hand and the United States on the other. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. The former South African President Jacob Zuma testifies before an inquiry into state corruption. And Zimbabwe's inflation nearly doubles in June. It stands at over 175%.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible? And why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sumitra Naidu.
Hello, Naro.
This
Well, of course.
is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business. Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. You're watching Global Business Africa. South Africa's former president, Jacob Zuma, has denied breaking the law in relation to the corruption charges against him. Mr. Zuma is insisting, publicly in fact, that he's a victim of a conspiracy by those who sought to oust him from power. He's alleged to have allowed the plunder of state resources to the tunes of billions of dollars and influenced government appointments as well.
I've been a subject of talk in this country for more than a decade. I've been vilified, alleged to be the king of corrupt people. I'm the most corrupt. I've been given every other name, and I'd never responded to those issues. Firstly, because I believe it is important that we all respect one another, that we must say things we know about other people, not just tell things that we cannot prove.
All right then, so let's get the measure of what exactly came out of day one of testimony by the country's former president. Lumkile Monde is a senior lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He joins us now live, in fact, from that very city. Lumkile, thank you very much for your time for us tonight. Did you, as a South African, did you ever think the country would get to this point where the former head of state is being held to account publicly at that by institutions? Because, as we recall, Mr. Zuma had resisted setting up this commission of inquiry ever since it was recommended.
Good evening and thanks for having me. This commission really confirms the robustness of the new democracy in South Africa, that today we have a president who really took the nation to the dark world, talking about spies, tricks, and conspiracies, when in fact he had been a president for 10 years and said very little to own up and take responsibility, push back all the questions, hiding behind conspiracies, and him being at the center of being a victim than owning up and taking responsibility for South Africa's economic slowdown in the past 10 years.
Right, so he's not taking responsibility at all, given what he said today, has he?
He fits exactly, this is typical Zuma. Zuma who laughs off every point and deflects it by his laugh without really owning up and saying, you know what, maybe the call I made to Themba Maseko to meet the Gupta families on the government information systems and the funding of AWN7 was wrong. If I know what I know today, I would have done it. No, he deflects, he pushbacks, he laughs back, and it's typical Zuma. He won't own up. It is all about him. It's him first and the country last. So we're not surprised why the events are turning the way they did today.
Right, let me go back to something you mentioned earlier, that this is about the strength of South African institutions. And Mr. Zuma's had accusations thrown against him. You remember when he was, I believe, Assistant Defence Minister, there were allegations of corruption involved in arms deals involving the South African National Defence Forces. And he pretty much got off that, although they've come back. But this time round, do you think that this is it, that something might eventually stick?
Well, in fact, very interestingly, he goes back there, but it doesn't tell us that there was a case called Shabir case, where Judge Squires, going through his own Zuma's personal account, exposed that he was living beyond his means and really got or received money from different sources, and therefore was part of the arms deal and should have been charged. He didn't talk about his role there, and instead went on, for example, to accuse others, former Minister of Energy, Minister Rama Nyang, as well as the former Minister of Communication, General Nyanda, as spies. So this is typical Zuma, where in terms of what he sees, given the inequalities of South Africa and the lack of progress by black people and high levels of unemployment, he's able to use those issues and presents himself as somebody who can resolve them in terms of radical economic transformation, when in fact it's all about him and those around him who went out to repurpose the state to loot public resources for his and his friends' benefits.
Indeed. We'll have to leave it there for the time being. Lumkile Monde, thank you very much for your input tonight. Now then, quite a bit of stuff to get through as far as that story is concerned. Of course, South Africa's president will be testifying this entire week, pretty much the entire week really, at the Zondo Commission. You can expect the latest developments right here on the programme. Now, we're still in the country. Much of South Africa's previous developments have been linked to two very specific sectors, mining being one and manufacturing being the other. But now the country's President Cyril Ramaphosa is taking advantage of the opportunities presented by a digital era. But here's the thing, all of the questions around the tech that are represented by the fourth industrial revolution, all the questions around how they will be applied, those are yet to be determined. Take this report from CGTN's Angelo Coppola.
The keynote address at the event was delivered by Dr. David Hansen, creator of Sophia, an internationally renowned AI platform.
I love to travel the world learning about humans and getting them excited for the future of technology.
We've really pushed the envelope of manufacturability, of the quality of the facial expressions, of the consistency of the manufacturing design, the intersection of the arts and the engineering into a whole system that we can use to help people.
AI and robotics can fulfill some tasks and do so more efficiently, but at this stage that's limited.
I think it depends on how much repetitive tasks do you do in your day-to-day activities. If you do a lot of that, yes, there's a possibility. If you don't do a lot of the same task over and over, not soon at all. Having said that, some tasks are easier to automate than others.
On a broader level, Hansen is looking at AI to get involved in creativity and blue sky thinking.
Living, carrying machines that enhance humanity's capacity for creativity, that enhance the survival of life on the planet, like super benevolent, super intelligence. And that's not just AI that would achieve that, but this synergy with our machines.
Automation has played a pivotal role in the industrialization of the globe.
Automation enables companies to grow and to go forward. Look at the car you're driving. Will that car be affordable for you and I if it was handmade? So automation and robotics definitely drive the future, not only the future, the current as well, but the future of the consumable items that we can afford.
There are some concerns that AI could be misused.
Finding out how AI can help us and noting and seeing the way that it could maybe complicate our lives, and choosing the right path, while at the same time not forgetting to let ourselves dream a little bit.
There's no question that artificial intelligence has a role to play in the survival and continued survival of the planet. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
On to Zimbabwe now. Inflation over there has surged to 175% in June, and the month before that it was just about 98%. Commodity prices are also up by almost 40%, following years of deflation. The government recently announced that the RTGS dollar is the sole legal tender in the country, effectively ending a full decade of dollarization. Now, the new legal tender has since then fallen by over 28%, lingering at about 8.77 against the dollar in official markets on Monday. But of course, it's trading at a 22% premium above that in parallel ones. Back in 2008, inflation peaked at 500 billion%, which prompted the scrapping of the Zimbabwean dollar. Right, then let's get the latest on this from CGTN's Farai Mokutuya. He's live in Harare tonight. So, Farai, given the weaknesses that we're seeing in the transitional currency, the RTGS dollar, a rise in inflation was definitely going to happen at some point. It was a question of when, not necessarily if. But the finance minister says he expects inflation to start falling from October. Why?
Well, Rama, if you look back to October 2018, that is when the rate of inflation spiked, and that was driven by the collapse of the bond note, or RTGS dollar, to the US dollar on the parallel market. I think the rate shot up to as much as 6-1 on that parallel market, and that effectively shot inflation up to double digits territory. And so from a technical point of view, looking at the way in which year-on-year inflation is calculated, the base from which inflation will be calculated come October this year means that we should see it narrow compared to other months. So June, that you just mentioned, where it's 176%, inflation in June 2018 was about between 3 to 5%, certainly single-digit territory. And so compared to the situation now, it is much, much higher. And so that is why we are seeing those figures go much higher. But the minister basing his prediction of inflation falling in October on the fact that that the base from which it will be calculated come October this year will be a lot higher because of the inflation rate as it was last year. But also beyond that, I think he's also spoken about prices coming down, and he is looking or expecting the reforms that he's undertaken, the currency reforms, for instance, to start working. The interbank rate, the interbank market, for instance, should eliminate the need for companies to go to the parallel market to source their foreign currency, because they should be able to get it from a formal, more stable market. And so because a lot of the inflation and price hikes are driven because of the black market rate, we should see prices come down because of that. Also the fact that, government is limiting money supply and money creation. It's reduced its borrowing, it's not printing money, it's not issuing treasury bills. The fact that there's limited money supply, restricting that money supply, should also ease the inflationary pressures. But I must hasten to add that there are a number of factors that are militating against the minister's predictions. Key amongst those is the energy situation. These power cuts are wreaking havoc on industry, and so companies are required, some companies are resorting to using generators, and those fuel costs are unanticipated and will push up the price of their goods and services. But also where companies can't use generators, production.
Well, it does seem we've lost that signal there. That was, of course, CGTN's Farai Moktuya there live in Harare, Zimbabwe. Now, time for a short break on the programme. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up next. China's economy grows by 6.3% in the first half of 2019. And the UK launches the world's first training programme for trade negotiators.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Accra is my kind of city. That's because when I'm here, I feel like I'm back home in Lagos or Abidjan, which are two of the major cities I grew up in.
Business in Africa is high risk.
After about a decade covering business news on the continent, I've learned it's all about the high risk, but also the high returns and the high energy. You simply have to adjust in order to keep pace. When I started out as a journalist, my dream was to open people's minds to the different perspectives. From the CEO in the boardroom to the trader out in the street, we all have different stories. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Cairo to Cape Town, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Here at CGTN, we realize that Africa is on the move, and it's moving fast, but we're moving right along with it. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, and I'm a business anchor and reporter at CGTN.
Welcome back. Let's recap the stories making you headlines at this hour. Starting in Rwanda, the health ministry over there is warning its citizens against traveling to Goma following reports of a confirmed Ebola case there. Goods purchased from the neighboring DRC are expected to be sourced locally until the situation has been brought under control. Also, authorities in Somalia expected to increase security operations ahead of regional polls scheduled for August. This comes amid frosty relations between Mogadishu and the regional government in Kismayo over the venue for the upcoming elections. And finally, the first China-Africa Peace and Security Forum is being held in Beijing. The defense ministers and military chiefs attending are talking about security, peace and funding. The country is trying to strengthen security ties with African economies as its investments across the continent grow in tandem with the Belt and Road Initiative. That's a run through your headlines. Now, speaking of China, the economic performance of the world's second largest economy in the first half of 2019 has increased. Official data shows the GDP growth rate for that period was 6.3%. Now, that in turn has led to an increase in activity in the service sector. CGTN's Zhou Yun breaks down the numbers.
Solid growth and broad stability. The country's GDP grew 6.2% in the second quarter of this year, and that brings China's growth rate to 6.3% for the first half of 2019, hitting 45 trillion yuan. That's around 6.5 trillion US dollars. Other data released also show economy still growing at a steady pace. The country's total value added of industrial enterprises posted steady growth in the same period, up by 6% year-on-year. Fixed asset investment growth was 5.8% in the first half of the year, faster than the growth in the first 5 months. Also, employment has remained stable, with the unemployment rate in urban areas at 5.1%. A spokesperson for the National Bureau of Statistics said the economy has performed within a reasonable range while moving steadily towards its goal of high-quality development.
The economy has sustained the momentum of progress in overall stability. However, we should also be aware that the economic conditions are still severe both at home and abroad. The global economic growth is slowing down. The imbalanced and inadequate development at home is still acute.
Internal and external challenges do remain for the country's economy, but experts say that even though downward pressure lingered in the second half, solid fundamentals can still bring optimism for the country's development.
我认为下半年的整体的经济应该会显示出更强的韧性。
I think there will be greater resilience shown in terms of the economic performance, which will be reflected in 3 aspects. First, large-scale tax cuts and fee reductions will provide stronger support to the economy. Then counter-cyclical adjustment measures will strengthen macro-prudent management. And finally, opening up and reform is also a big boost to our confidence.
Solid result from the first half of the year has laid a very good foundation for the continued economic growth. Challenges ahead do remain, but experts say that China is capable to withstand pressure as well as propel economic growth. So, CGTN, Beijing.
Experts from around the world have gathered in Shenzhen to see what role China can play in the future of artificial intelligence and machine learning. CGTN's Gay Yunfei is at that summit and filed this report.
This room is filled with thousands of young engineers keen for the sparks from the pioneering scholars. There are even some arguments outside from people who couldn't squeeze themselves in. This is the Global AI and Robotics Summit in China's Silicon Valley, Shenzhen.
Well, although we are in the top frontier of AI as we are working at the universities, but you still can feel that it is an eye-opening experience for many audience here.
These passionate developers are evidence of China's explosive AI industry growth. According to the Wuzhen Institute, since 2000, the global AI industry has raised a total of $78.5 billion US dollars, 72 billion of it coming in just the last 5 years. And the market in China is even hotter. In 2018, Chinese AI enterprises raised $15.6 billion, accounting for nearly half of the total
improvement in the futures. So all technologies is money burning.
China's booming AI industry is luring more and more leading Chinese scientists back home. But they say the situation here in China is somewhat different than elsewhere.
I feel that in America, AI research is more calm and steady. In China, some people
used in many good ways, like in fintech, education, and security. But everything has 2 sides. AI,
their lives, their futures.
This is not Mark Zuckerberg.
And secondly, the developers also need self-discipline to not do these kinds of things.
Experts at the summit say AI is still in its early stages.
Now, Britain has launched the world's first ever training program to recruit and train tomorrow's trade negotiators. Now, the 2-year international trade development scheme is open to applicants from all backgrounds and levels of qualifications. The idea is to develop the UK's talent pool of trade policy and promotion experts as the country prepares to leave the European Union. According to the UK's Trade Minister, the new recruits will have to learn the practical skills of international trade talks. They'll be paid about $37,600. The UK cannot formally sign trade deals with other countries, however, until it's formally left the European Union. But it has been working to replicate agreements in order to lay the groundwork for new deals in the future.
If you want to sell Britain properly, you have to know what Britain has to sell, but you have to also understand the markets that we're selling into. And that's why we think it's so important to give youngsters the opportunity to be part of our teams in one of our overseas posts.
We've got plenty of trade negotiating talent, but what we need to have is greater diversity and greater choice, and for people to enter it at a younger age.
Let's turn over to retail now. The advanced tech, facial recognition, for instance, digital payments that are now being used at a large scale by retail titans like Walmart and Amazon are likely to change the traditional shopping experience as we know it in a matter of years.
This smart Walmart store takes up 4,600 square meters and is equipped with numerous sensors, cameras, and data processors. The technology can recognize the merchandise and track their inventory numbers. It can also judge the degree of freshness of the store's fruit and vegetables, so staff can replace the items with new goods as needed. The system can also calculate the number of cards and cashiers needed at a given time to improve efficiency.
Real-time information about everything that's on our shelves and how that product is moving through our systems, through our supply chains. A lot of, I think, what you'll see when it comes to artificial intelligence and machine learning is understanding that whole logistical supply chain of things, understanding the products that are on the shelves when the customers want them.
Amazon also enjoys a high profile in the new retail area. This is the non-staff store of Amazon. State-of-the-art technology has reshaped customers' shopping experience. After scanning a QR code at the entrance, customers can start their trip through the store. They don't need to stand in line and pay at a counter after shopping. They can just leave. Sensors in the store can track customers all along and keep records of their purchasing behavior in their Amazon accounts.
Really straightforward, very quick, very easy. Probably the longest part was actually just downloading the app and putting my details in.
You don't have the card, you don't have the money, it's really crazy.
New technology will eventually revolutionize the retail sector, but there will be also some setbacks. For example, how to withdraw or exchange goods in non-staffed stores and the potential leakage of private customer data. 宋耀天 CGTN.
Now, China's famous spicy hot pot seems to have taken root in South Korea. Many restaurants have been tailoring the menus in order to meet growing demand for that particular commodity. But there's also a bit of caution in the air because owners know just how unpredictable the catering industry can be in South Korea. Here's Shane Ham with more.
It's the latest lip and tongue-numbingly delicious food trend to hit South Korea. Chinese spicy hot pot, or maratang as it's known locally, is all the rage. Diners select their favorite ingredients such as vegetables, fish cakes, and tofu along with their choice of meat. It's then prepared to be eaten in individual bowls.
It's spicy and stimulating, so it's very addictive. I think it goes well with beer too, especially with a friend after work.
It's our first time trying it today. I like how the broth is clear with some sort of chili oil in it, so I thought it would be greasy, but the mallow sauce really takes the greasiness away, and it fits my taste buds well.
Koreans are typically accustomed to spicy foods, but the Sichuan spice used in maratang gives it a unique flavor unfamiliar to Korean cuisine, and restaurateurs are hoping to cash in on the trend.
From what we can ascertain, in Seoul there are about 200 restaurants that have mala in their business name, and in 2019, roughly 60 new businesses were registered. That means the number of restaurants has doubled compared to 2017.
Just as popular as the fiery dish are imported Chinese beers. In fact, sales of Chinese beers have seen an uptick in sales in recent years, according to South Korea's largest supermarket chain. Both online and offline demand for the mala spice is also on the rise for home consumption. In the age of social media, food fads come and go as quickly as the latest viral video. Up until a few years ago, for instance, lamb skewers were all the rage here. Now it's Chinese hot pot. The problem, though, is what happens when that novelty wears off.
Restaurants with popular food need characteristics, whether that be price, ingredients or ambience. If you can't do that, there's a high chance of failure, so owners need to prepare thoroughly.
Local experts suggest the recent boom in Chinese cuisine is because of the increase in cross-border exchanges between the two countries. An example of two cultures bridging the divide through food, one spicy slurp at a time. Shane Hom, CGTN, Seoul.
All right, then on to something that's probably not as spicy, commodities. So let's start with Brent crude. Brent crude shed about 0.4% by 1600 GMT. It actually did fall below this level. 66.48 was the price at that point in time. Over in the world's biggest oil producer, roughly 3/4 of the output in the Gulf of Mexico has basically been shut down because of adverse weather. Coffee futures, incidentally, they're close to where they started the year at $109. But the question, of course, is will it actually stay at that level for the foreseeable future? We'll find out. Here's what's coming up next. We'll explore the incentives that Egypt is providing to lure foreign car makers into the North African country.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
The greatest journeys. The greatest sights. The greatest adventures.
Here in Qanater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back. Egypt is reviving its automotive industry, and authorities are looking to introduce new sources of national income and foreign currency earnings and export.
Chinese companies such as Brilliance are aiming to benefit from a new set of incentives from the government.
Locally.
The Egyptian car market has been suffering a major slowdown since the devaluation of the Egyptian pounds 3 years ago, and the government is trying to give it a major boost.
The state is providing facilities like easier licenses for manufacturing, cheaper and quicker land allocation, less paperwork, less cost and cancelling tariffs on imported raw material. Tax incentives as well are expected.
The car makers are not just targeting the local market.
Average sales in the market here are only 200,000 vehicles per year. All vehicle types, not just cars, which is a very small market for producers. Manufacturers will be exporting to the Middle East and Africa from Egypt, making use of Egypt's free trade agreements with Arab and African countries to export to these markets with zero tariffs.
The incentives provided by the government for the foreign auto companies will also benefit the Egyptian economy. It will create local feeder industries, more job opportunities, and an inflow of foreign currency. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
All right, then a quick run through currencies as we wrap up the program. The Kenyan shilling still pretty much weakening. 103.1 was one of the highlights that we actually did see today. 103.05 is pretty much where it did close in today's trading session. At that point, the currency is about 1.3% weaker against the American dollar. But the story that was of interest to us today was Zambia, actually. It's 2022 Eurobond and the other longer dated notes as well. They got a shot in the arm today with the appointment of a new finance minister. Bwalya Ngandu is actually the former deputy governor of the country's central bank. Bond prices went up by about 1.7% to near 67 cents to the dollar. But can those gains last, given the massive Herculean task ahead of the finance minister? We'll find out as part of the ever-continuing story of business in Africa. That's it tonight from this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content that you've seen here in the last 60 minutes. Plenty of ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Rama Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.